When it comes to holding leaders accountable, few voices have been as bold and direct as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Recently, she dropped a political bombshell by exposing what she described as a $58 million scandal tied to New York City Mayor Eric Adams. This revelation has sparked waves of debate, not just because of the eye-catching dollar figure, but also because of the silence that followed from certain media outlets, most notably Fox News. Crockett's accusations have brought questions of corruption, accountability, and transparency to the forefront, forcing many to take a hard look at how taxpayer money is handled and whether powerful figures are being shielded from scrutiny. Her bold stance has not only highlighted alleged financial misconduct but also called out the imbalance in media coverage, raising bigger concerns about how narratives are shaped in American politics. Crockett's exposure of Eric Adams' alleged $58 million scandal represents one of the most striking examples of how a single voice in politics can ignite a national conversation about accountability and corruption in leadership. When a public official is accused of being tied to the mismanagement or questionable use of tens of millions of dollars, the gravity of the allegation is enormous, because it not only places the individual under a microscope but also challenges the very systems that allowed such a situation to occur. Jasmine Crockett, known for her sharp questioning and bold style in the political arena, made it clear that the scandal was not just about numbers on a ledger but about the trust that citizens place in their leaders and how easily that trust can be violated when oversight is weak or when power shields wrongdoing. By framing the alleged scandal as a misuse of $58 million, she pulled the public into a larger discussion of how taxpayer money is being spent and whether political figures like Eric Adams are prioritizing the needs of the community or leveraging resources for their own interests. The way Crockett delivered this bombshell added weight to her words because it came across not as casual speculation but as a pointed accusation backed by concern for integrity and governance. In political discourse, numbers like $58 million resonate because they are tangible. They represent schools that could have been funded, infrastructure that could have been repaired, social programs that could have been expanded, and countless other ways the money could have benefited the people. When Crockett exposed this alleged scandal, she was not only questioning Adams' leadership but also forcing the public to imagine the scale of opportunity lost if these funds were indeed mishandled. Such a perspective makes the accusation much more relatable and impactful, as ordinary citizens can clearly see what $58 million means for a city already struggling with challenges such as housing, crime, and public services. The scandal also highlights how political figures can sometimes operate within a space where accountability is blurred, and Crockett's intervention worked to sharpen that focus. Eric Adams, as mayor of New York City, holds one of the most powerful and visible positions in American municipal politics, and any financial scandal linked to his office is not just a local issue but a national concern. Crockett's exposure of the scandal shines a light on how corruption or misuse of funds at the city level can ripple outward, affecting federal and state relations, as well as public confidence in urban governance. Her decision to publicly call out the alleged misconduct shows a willingness to confront power directly, which in itself is a bold move given the political influence that Adams holds and the potential backlash that can follow when challenging high-profile leaders. Another critical element of this keynote is the underlying theme of political courage. It is often easier for lawmakers to stay silent or avoid calling out members of their own political sphere, especially when the individual in question wields significant influence or has a strong public following. Crockett's decision to step forward with this revelation demonstrates not only her own commitment to accountability but also her understanding of the role that truth-telling plays in shaping public trust. By exposing Adams, she positioned herself as someone unafraid of confronting difficult truths, even when the fallout could be unpredictable. That willingness to speak truth to power is central to a functioning democracy, because it ensures that even the most powerful figures are not above scrutiny. The alleged $58 million scandal, as described by Crockett, also forces a discussion about systemic weaknesses that allow financial irregularities to occur in the first place. When large sums of public money are mishandled or directed in questionable ways, it is rarely the work of one person alone. Instead, it often points to a network of enablers, loopholes in oversight, and failures in transparency mechanisms. By putting this issue in the spotlight, Crockett not only drew attention to Adams himself but also to the larger system that may have failed to prevent the scandal. This approach broadens the conversation from being about a single leader's actions to a broader critique of governance structures that do not adequately safeguard public resources. The way Crockett framed the scandal also underscores the role of public accountability in a digital and media-driven age. Once an allegation of this magnitude is made, it becomes difficult for political figures to operate without responding, because the public expects clarity and accountability. Even if Fox News and other media outlets chose silence, the amplification of Crockett's words through social platforms and alternative media ensures that the scandal does not simply vanish into the background. The people are increasingly demanding transparency, and Crockett's revelation is an example of how leaders can leverage their platform to create a wave of awareness that puts pressure on the system. In this way, the scandal becomes less about private whispers in political halls and more about a public demand for answers. The human element of this keynote should not be overlooked either. At its core, $58 million represents more than figures in a budget. It represents the lives of ordinary New Yorkers who rely on their government to act responsibly and prioritize their needs. Whether it is in the form of public safety programs, educational opportunities, or community development, these funds symbolize hope for progress, and any allegation that such resources were mismanaged or mishandled feels like a betrayal to the very citizens who place their faith in elected officials. Crockett's ability to articulate this sense of betrayal and channel public frustration into a demand for accountability is a powerful demonstration of how leaders can bridge the gap between political action and public sentiment. Her exposure also raises questions about how political scandals are often buried or ignored until someone with a platform decides to make them visible. In many cases, financial misconduct can remain hidden for years, shielded by layers of bureaucracy, legal maneuvering, and media disinterest. By breaking the silence, Crockett disrupted this cycle and forced a conversation that might have otherwise been swept under the rug. The very act of bringing the scandal into public light is a reminder that vigilance is necessary at every level of government, and that even the most well-connected politicians cannot assume that their actions will go unchecked indefinitely. This creates a precedent where other leaders may think twice before engaging in questionable practices, knowing that exposure is always a possibility when courageous voices like Crockett's refuse to remain silent. The media silence surrounding Crockett's exposure of Eric Adams' alleged $58 million scandal brings into sharp focus the problem of selective coverage and bias in American politics. When a sitting congresswoman makes a public allegation against the mayor of one of the largest cities in the United States involving such a staggering amount of money, the expectation is that it would dominate headlines across networks and news outlets. Instead, the quiet response, particularly from Fox News, raises critical questions about how stories are chosen, framed, or ignored altogether depending on political leanings, audience demographics, or network priorities. In the modern information ecosystem, silence can be just as powerful as coverage, because the absence of reporting on such a bombshell effectively diminishes its weight in the public consciousness, leaving many citizens unaware of serious accusations that should otherwise be scrutinized and debated. This silence points to the troubling reality that media outlets may not always operate as neutral arbiters of truth but instead as gatekeepers that decide which narratives serve their interests. Fox News' choice not to amplify Crockett's exposure of Adams illustrates how selective silence can protect certain figures while vilifying others, depending on what fits the network's preferred political storylines. Over the years, Fox has built its reputation on being outspoken and aggressive in exposing scandals tied to figures aligned with the opposing political spectrum, often dedicating days of coverage to stories that reinforce its ideological stance. Yet, when Crockett put forward claims of Adams' alleged scandal, the muted response suggested that this particular story did not align with the network's strategic narrative. Perhaps it did not serve their audience to see Adams under fire from a Democrat like Crockett, or perhaps the network calculated that elevating her words would inadvertently give her more influence and credibility. Either way, the silence becomes an editorial decision with far-reaching implications, because it denies the public the full spectrum of information needed to form opinions based on facts rather than filtered narratives. This media silence also brings into question the broader role of journalism in a democratic society. News outlets are supposed to serve as watchdogs, holding those in power accountable regardless of their political affiliation. When $58 million is at the center of an allegation, journalists have a duty to investigate, verify, and report on the issue because it directly involves taxpayer funds and public trust. The fact that such a significant claim could be largely ignored reveals a failure in fulfilling that watchdog role. This failure does not just affect public perception of Adams but also undermines confidence in the media itself, as people begin to question whether the information they receive is filtered, curated, or outright censored to serve hidden agendas. Silence in this case is not neutrality, it is a choice that shields power from scrutiny and contributes to the erosion of transparency in the political process. The public impact of such silence cannot be overstated, because media coverage shapes awareness, dialogue, and action. When the media highlights a scandal, it sparks debate, pressures officials to respond, and often forces investigations. When the media ignores a scandal, it sends the opposite signal, that the issue is not important enough to warrant attention, even if the dollar amount involved could transform communities. For many citizens, the media serves as their primary source of information, and without coverage, they may never know that $58 million of their money is under question. This selective reporting therefore robs the public of the chance to demand answers, effectively muting civic engagement and reinforcing a dangerous cycle where leaders can escape scrutiny simply because networks choose to look the other way. Another layer of the issue lies in how media bias can deepen polarization. In a society where people increasingly consume news from outlets that align with their existing beliefs, the absence of coverage on one side creates vastly different realities for different groups of people. Those who rely on Fox News for their political understanding may never hear Crockett's allegations against Adams, while those who engage with other outlets or social media may view the scandal as a pressing issue. This divide fuels misinformation, distrust, and tribalism, because people are not starting from the same foundation of facts. Crockett's exposure of the scandal should have been an opportunity for a collective conversation about corruption and accountability, but instead the selective silence ensured that the story was fragmented and unevenly distributed across audiences. The role of social media in filling this silence is also worth examining. In an era when traditional outlets fail to cover critical stories, platforms like Twitter, YouTube, and independent media often pick up the slack, amplifying voices like Crockett's to audiences who are eager for unfiltered truth. However, this dynamic is a double-edged sword, because while it ensures that some version of the story reaches the public, it also means that coverage becomes less centralized and more vulnerable to distortion, misrepresentation, or outright disinformation. Fox News' silence did not kill the story entirely, but it did weaken its reach, forcing citizens to seek out alternative sources that may or may not present the information accurately. This raises further concerns about the role of mainstream media in abandoning its responsibility and leaving a vacuum that less reliable outlets are only too happy to fill. The silence also speaks volumes about the power dynamics between politicians and the media. Eric Adams, as mayor of New York City, is a figure with significant influence, connections, and media presence. It is not unusual for major outlets to tread carefully when dealing with figures of such stature, especially when those figures maintain relationships that can either grant or restrict access to information. The reluctance to cover Crockett's claims could reflect a calculated effort to avoid antagonizing Adams or damaging relationships with sources close to his administration. Such dynamics are troubling because they suggest that the flow of information to the public is not determined by the significance of the story but by backroom considerations of access, influence, and power preservation. Furthermore, the silence around the scandal reflects a growing trend where certain political figures are insulated from criticism by the very outlets that should hold them accountable. When leaders know that parts of the media landscape will protect them through omission, they are emboldened to operate with less fear of consequences. Crockett's exposure of the $58 million scandal was intended to break through that insulation, but the lack of media amplification reduced the impact and allowed Adams to avoid the level of public scrutiny that such a scandal would normally demand. This creates a precedent that undermines democracy, because accountability becomes inconsistent. Applied selectively depending on political convenience rather than universal standards of truth and justice. At its core, the silence from Fox News and similar outlets underscores a broader crisis in American media, the loss of trust. Citizens increasingly feel that they cannot rely on traditional news sources to provide unbiased, comprehensive coverage, and moments like this reinforce that suspicion. The $58 million scandal, whether proven or not, deserved to be interrogated and explored, not brushed aside. Crockett's voice cut through the noise, but without amplification from major networks, her revelations risk being reduced to political theater rather than treated as serious allegations worthy of investigation. This is the true danger of media silence. It not only diminishes the weight of critical stories but also erodes the foundational trust between the public, the press, and the political system that relies on both to function transparently. The broader impact of Crockett's exposure of Eric Adams' alleged $58 million scandal extends far beyond the immediate accusations and silence from certain media outlets, because at its core this controversy is about the health of democracy, the erosion of public trust, and the ongoing struggle to ensure transparency and governance. When a figure like Crockett shines a light on potential misuse of funds at such a massive scale, it forces society to confront uncomfortable questions about whether its institutions are truly built to protect citizens from corruption or whether they are designed to shield those in power. The public begins to ask why such scandals keep recurring, why accountability seems selective, and whether their voices can truly make a difference in holding leaders accountable. Every time allegations like this surface, the cracks in public trust widen, because people start to feel as though the government they fund and empower through their votes is not working in their interest but instead serving the agendas of a privileged few who operate above scrutiny. This erosion of trust has serious consequences for democracy itself, because the legitimacy of any government depends not only on winning elections but on maintaining the faith of the people. A scandal involving $58 million does not simply represent lost money, it symbolizes broken promises, missed opportunities, and the betrayal of public confidence. Citizens who see these kinds of stories unfold without clear accountability or consequences begin to withdraw from the democratic process, believing that their voices and votes are powerless against entrenched corruption. Voter apathy, civic disengagement, and political cynicism are natural byproducts of this disillusionment, and they create a dangerous cycle where fewer people participate in holding leaders accountable, thereby giving those same leaders even more room to operate without oversight. Crockett's exposure thus resonates as more than an attack on one politician, it is a warning about the long-term damage that scandals and lack of transparency can inflict on the very foundations of democracy. The demand for transparency becomes even more urgent in a case like this, because transparency is the antidote to secrecy and corruption. When officials are accused of misusing funds, the public's expectation is not only for investigations but also for clarity, detailed reporting, and open processes that reveal how the money was allocated, who benefited, and whether legal or ethical lines were crossed. Without transparency, suspicion festers, and speculation replaces facts, further deepening the divide between leaders and the people they govern. Crockett's decision to make this alleged scandal public is itself an act of pushing for transparency, because by speaking openly about it she prevented it from being buried under bureaucratic language or behind closed doors. In doing so, she highlighted the role that whistleblowers and outspoken leaders play in ensuring that information is not monopolized by those in power but made accessible to the very people who are most affected. The impact of the scandal also ripples into conversations about inequality, because misuse of public funds is rarely abstract, it directly affects the lives of those who most rely on government support. $58 million could change the landscape of public housing, improve education systems, or expand healthcare access in a city like New York, where disparities in wealth and resources are stark. When money that could uplift struggling communities is allegedly diverted or mishandled, the result is not just financial loss but the deepening of systemic inequalities. Crockett's exposure therefore speaks to broader issues of justice and fairness, because it reminds people that corruption is not victimless, it robs ordinary citizens of opportunities to live better, safer, and more dignified lives. This dimension of the scandal makes it especially damaging, because it touches on the moral responsibility of leaders to serve the most vulnerable rather than exploit the resources entrusted to them. Public trust in institutions does not only rest on whether scandals are exposed but also on how they are addressed after exposure. If allegations of this magnitude are ignored, dismissed, or quietly settled without real accountability, the message sent to citizens is that there are two systems of justice, one for the powerful and another for everyone else. This perception can fuel anger, protest, and unrest, as people demand equality under the law and fair treatment regardless of political stature. Crockett's exposure of Adams' alleged scandal is therefore a test not only of Adams' credibility but of the entire system's ability to investigate and enforce standards fairly. Every institution involved, from the city government to oversight agencies, becomes implicated in how they respond, because silence or inaction would signal complicity and further erode public faith. The broader impact is also felt in the realm of media trust, because the scandal and its muted coverage reveal to citizens that they cannot rely on traditional outlets to consistently report the truth. This distrust pushes people to seek out alternative sources, sometimes reliable but often not, leading to an environment where misinformation thrives. When mainstream outlets fail to amplify stories of accountability, they indirectly strengthen the influence of fringe voices who claim to provide the real story, even if their narratives are distorted. This creates a fragmented public sphere where facts are contested, trust is fractured, and unity becomes harder to achieve. Crockett's bombshell thus not only raises questions about political corruption but also highlights the desperate need for media institutions to rebuild credibility by prioritizing truth over partisan convenience. In addition, the scandal underlines the critical role of independent oversight and the need for stronger safeguards against corruption. It demonstrates that relying solely on political leaders or mainstream media to self-police is insufficient. Citizens and advocacy groups are reminded that they must demand structural reforms, such as stricter auditing systems, clearer reporting requirements, and more severe penalties for misconduct, to prevent such large sums of money from slipping through the cracks. The exposure of Adams' alleged scandal is an example of why checks and balances must be more than theoretical principles, they must be actively enforced mechanisms that ensure public resources are managed with integrity. Without reforms, scandals like this will continue to emerge, and each new one will further undermine the fragile relationship between the people and their government. Finally, the broader impact lies in how this scandal shapes political culture. When figures like Crockett boldly expose wrongdoing, it creates a culture where honesty and accountability are celebrated, and when silence or dismissal follows, it creates the opposite, a culture of impunity. The political landscape is shaped by these moments, and they either encourage future leaders to act with integrity or embolden them to act without fear of consequences. The $58 million scandal has the potential to serve as a turning point in political discourse, one that either galvanizes the public to demand higher standards or further entrenches cynicism about the state of governance. Crockett's decision to speak out was an act of challenging the status quo, and the response, or lack thereof, will determine whether that challenge sparks real change or becomes another example of how the system absorbs scandals without addressing the deeper issues that give rise to them.